The relentless heat of September baked the red Oklahoma dust into the wooden bones of the frontier town. It was 1883, and horses neighed, cattle bellowed, and men barked over prices with whiskey breath and worn boots. The last livestock auction of autumn was winding down, but a crowd still lingered near the auction block, where a bay mare stood trembling, ribs sharp under her hide, flanks marked with dried blood. Samuel Carter adjusted his Stetson against the glare, silent as ever. At 38, he was a man shaped by the vast prairie and endless sky, forged by the solitude that came with working 2,000 acres of Oklahoma territory with only the wind for company. He rarely came to town unless it was for supplies or horses, and he had spotted the mare earlier that morning, circling back now as the bidding thinned. His boot heels thudded against the packed earth as he approached the auction platform. That was when he noticed her. A girl, no more than 19, stood just behind the wooden fence. Her auburn hair was matted to her face, her simple cotton dress torn at the hem. Her bare feet were caked with dust and small cuts, as if she'd walked miles over rough ground. She did not speak, did not cry. Her green eyes wandered unfocused, as if following something no one else could see. Standing beside her was a man with a bottle of corn liquor in one hand and a rope in the other. The rope was tied not to an animal, but to her wrist. "Got me a mute one here," the drunk hollered to no one in particular, his voice cutting through the dusty air. "Came out of my first wife, God rest her soul. Don't talk, don't hear neither, but she cleans, cooks, don't sass back. Cheap as last season's grain." A few men chuckled darkly. One spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Samuel turned away. He didn't want this burden. He had come for a horse, nothing more. But then he felt it. Not a voice, not a cry, just a glance. The girl was watching him. No desperation in her face, no pleading in her posture. Just a look, clear, still, fixed on his weathered features. And in that look was something he hadn't seen in a long time. Understanding, or maybe a reflection of his own profound loneliness. The drunk stumbled closer, corn liquor sloshing. "You got coin, mister? Want the horse? She comes with it. I ain't dragging her back, ain't worth the dust on her toes." Samuel hesitated. The mare pawed at the ground, blowing foam through her nostrils. The girl's gaze never moved from his face. He turned back, looked the drunk square in the eye. "I'll take both." The laughter from nearby men was instant and crude. "You buying livestock or starting a charity, Carter?" one called out. Samuel didn't answer. He counted silver dollars into the man's trembling hand, enough for a horse, though no amount could ever pay for a human soul. The drunk yanked the rope toward him, but the girl flinched, stepping instinctively behind Samuel. "She's yours now," the man slurred. "Don't say I didn't warn you. Ain't worth feeding." Samuel untied the rope and tossed it back like it was a rattlesnake. He guided the mare out of the pen, the girl walking behind with soft, deliberate steps. She carried nothing but a thin shawl draped over her shoulders. When they reached his wagon, she stopped and waited, still silent. He opened the back and motioned for her to climb in. She did, folding herself into the corner like someone used to being invisible. As he climbed up to the driver's bench, he felt the faintest tug on his coat. He looked down. Her fingers, small and calloused, had brushed his sleeve just once. She didn't look at him now, her gaze resting on the distant mesas, but in that single touch, he felt it. She hadn't thanked him, hadn't begged, but she had chosen, in that moment, to trust him. Samuel Carter, who spoke more with horses than men, who lived alone on endless Oklahoma prairie with fence posts for company and scars he never named, now carried with him a girl who couldn't hear, a girl who might understand more than anyone had ever guessed. He snapped the reins. The wagon creaked forward, wheels crunching over the hardpan road out of town. Behind him, the girl sat curled beneath a blanket, face turned to the wind that swept down from the mesas. She never looked back. Neither did he. The wagon rolled through dusk and dust, winding between low hills and scattered mesquite until the fields widened and the sky opened into Oklahoma's vast emptiness. Samuel's ranch wasn't much to look at, just a main house with a tin roof, a few outbuildings, and a long stretch of prairie where cattle grazed under the endless sky. But it was quiet, clean, and for a man like him, it had always been enough. Until now. He helped the girl down from the wagon, unsure if she would bolt or freeze, but she stepped lightly to the ground. Her eyes swept the land, not frightened, just watchful, as if cataloguing everything without asking permission. Inside the kitchen, Samuel stoked the fire and pointed to the coffee pot. She nodded and moved toward it without hesitation, finding the tin cups and ladle like someone who'd always belonged near fire and sustenance. Still, she hadn't made a sound. After supper, he handed her a piece of chalk from the cabinet and tapped the wooden door frame beside the table. "Name," he said slowly, exaggerating the movement of his lips. She looked at him for a long moment, then crouched beside the frame. With careful fingers, she wrote a single name in soft, slanted letters. Grace. Grace. He read it once, then twice. Grace, he repeated out loud, like testing how it tasted on the Oklahoma air. She gave no smile, but she turned and walked away into the darkened barn. The next morning, Samuel found her in the stable, crouched beside the same beaten-down mare. The horse had barely eaten since the auction, its back legs swollen from old strain. Grace ran a damp cloth down the mare's flank, whispering with her hands, not words, not signs, just the careful rhythm of someone who listened with her palms and her breath. Samuel stood at the barn door, arms crossed. He had seen seasoned ranch hands get kicked for less, but the mare stayed still, shuddering only slightly, and let the girl wrap its leg with quiet patience. Maybe she couldn't hear, but she sure as hell understood. That day, Samuel gave her chores. Simple things: wash the floorboards, boil water, clean the tack room. She did them without complaint, without asking, without one sound. Each night he left chalk for her, and she would write notes in the margins of their world. Coffee low, dog limping, wind smells like rain. They never spoke, but the quiet didn't feel empty. Until the storm came. It started like most Oklahoma storms. Slow and deceptive. A hot breeze rose around sundown, brushing against the tall grass like a warning whisper. Samuel glanced at the sky, noticed a line of clouds brewing far off, but thought nothing of it. He was in the cattle shed when she appeared. Grace, barefoot, hair wild, breath quick but soundless. She grabbed his sleeve and tugged hard. "What?" he asked, startled. She pointed upward, her hands trembling, her eyes saying what her mouth could not. Danger. Now. He hesitated, halfway through checking a sick calf, but something in her gaze snapped him into motion. She pulled again, toward the barn door, away from the corral. Then it happened. A crack, no, a shatter. The world split in two as a bolt of lightning dropped from the heavens, striking the ancient cottonwood that loomed just behind the cattle shed. The blast shook the earth beneath them, sparks flew, the tree burst into flame and collapsed with a moan that sounded like the sky weeping. Samuel stumbled back, the calves bleated in terror, smoke curled into the darkening sky. He looked at her. Grace stood frozen just outside the doorway, her face lit by the flickering fire, eyes steady, chest rising fast. She had known, not guessed, not sensed. She had known before the thunder, before the air changed, before the wind even shifted. Samuel walked toward her, slow, still half in shock. "How did you—" But she only looked at him, silent, certain. That night, after the fire was doused and the animals calmed, he sat beside her at the kitchen table. No chalk this time, no words, just a man with his hands on the weathered wood and a girl who could not speak, and yet somehow she had heard something no one else could. Not thunder, not wind, but the warning inside the world itself. Samuel realized for the first time in years he wasn't alone. He looked at her hands, folded in her lap. "Grace," he said again. She lifted her eyes to meet his. Silence answered, and it was enough. Since the storm, Samuel had started to pay more attention, not with suspicion, but with the quiet curiosity of a man who had lived too long in silence and now found himself witnessing something he could not explain and maybe did not want to. Grace never spoke, never signed, never wrote much more than her name. She had no books, no formal learning, no words. And yet there were days when it seemed like she understood more than anyone he had ever known. One morning when the lead cow stood alone in the pasture, not eating, Samuel chalked it up to the cold snap. He made a note to watch her, but Grace moved without hesitation. She brought straw to the birthing stall, drew water with mint leaves from the well, and stood beside the cow, stroking her belly in slow, measured circles. By sunset, the cow was in labor. She had known. Somehow, she had known. Samuel said nothing, but he watched her that night. He could not sleep. The next day, he tried again. He came back from town with tension in his shoulders, the weight of old history heavy on his back. The territorial marshal had spoken in half-truths and warnings about land claims, whispers that his father had taken more than was rightfully his during the land rush, blood spilled over property lines, guilt that never faded. None of it was new, but it never stopped stinging. He did not speak a word of it to Grace, but when he sat on the front step, staring out into the falling dusk, she came and stood beside him. She did not speak, simply placed her hand on his shoulder, light as a prairie breeze, steady as breath. After a long moment, Samuel muttered, "How did you know I carry shame about this land? Shame about what my father did to keep it?" Grace's green eyes searched his. Then slowly she lifted her hand and placed it on his chest, right over his heart. After that, she turned and walked toward the old oak tree where his father's grave rested, silent under the Oklahoma sky. She had never read the stone, never asked questions, and yet she knew. At night, Samuel tossed in bed, sweating through a dream of gunfire and scorched earth. His father's voice came through the smoke, rough, proud, trembling. "I gave you the land, Samuel, and I gave you the blood that bought it." Samuel woke with a start, his breath loud in the stillness. And then he saw her. Grace sat in a chair by the hearth. She had lit a single candle, and in the flickering light her profile looked carved from shadow and grace. On the table beside the candle was a blue handkerchief, faded, trimmed with hand-stitched lace, his mother's. Samuel had not seen it in 10 years. It had been locked away in a cedar chest no one else touched. He sat up. "How?" Grace didn't look at him. She rose without a sound and walked to the door. She didn't need to explain. She had heard something no one else could. Not words, not memories, but pain, grief, the silent weight of guilt pressed between ribs, the aching sound of a man's heart breaking when he was too proud to let it be heard. And in her quiet, she answered. She heard. For the first time in Samuel's life he feared, not for his land, nor his legacy, nor even his soul. He feared losing the one person who knew what he felt before he ever said a word. The first whisper came from the blacksmith's wife. "She stares too long at the cattle," she said, folding dish towels under the porch, voice low but sharp as barbed wire, like she knows which one will drop next. By the end of the week, it was the preacher's son who added more kindling to the fire. "She touched our goat," he told a circle of curious ears, "and 2 days later it birthed too early. That ain't natural." No one had ever heard Grace speak, and the fewer words she gave, the more the town seemed eager to fill the silence for her, with fear. At the general store, a woman pulled her child behind her when Grace walked by, even though she only came to fetch flour. At the post office, someone spat near her feet. Most days, she kept her head down, never flinched. But Samuel saw how her fingers curled tighter around the basket in her arms, and how her footsteps became quieter, as if trying to disappear from ground that refused to forget. He did not speak of it to her, and she never asked why the world could not stand to see quiet kindness. But one afternoon, when a ranch hand's boy came down with burning fever, red-faced and seizing in his sleep, it was not the doctor who came. It was Grace. She moved softly into the barn where the child lay. She did not ask permission, merely knelt beside the cot, placed a hand on the boy's chest, then his forehead, and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she walked outside, cut 3 types of herbs from Samuel's drying rack, lavender, feverfew, and wild sage, and returned with a steaming cloth. The boy drank the steeped leaves in silence. By sunrise, he was sitting up, hungry again. His mother wept, held Grace's hand with trembling thanks, but the next day she could be heard whispering at the water pump. She didn't ask what the boy's symptoms were. How did she know? The fear was no longer quiet. 3 days later they came with torches, not lit, but carried like promises. 8 men and women, boots kicking up dust, stood at the gate of Samuel's ranch. The oldest among them, Mr. Patterson, a man whose own daughter hadn't spoken to him in years, stepped forward. "We want her gone," he said. "That girl hears things she oughtn't." Samuel stood in the barn's doorway, arms folded across his chest. He hadn't shaved in days, and his face was hard as the timber framing behind him. "She's mute," he said. "That ain't the same as deaf," Patterson snapped. "She sees what's coming before the sky even shifts. Talks to animals like they talk back. A steer of mine dropped dead last week, and she was the only one who touched it. You think she cursed it? I think she's cursed, period." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Inside the house, Grace stood behind the curtain. She had heard the gravel shift under their boots, had seen their faces twisted, not with hate, but something worse. Certainty. She moved to open the door, but Samuel held up a hand. He stepped forward, boots sinking slightly in the thawing mud, and faced them squarely. "She saved a child's life. Maybe she's the one who gave him the fever in the first place," a woman spat. Samuel didn't raise his voice. "She is the only person I know who truly listens," he said. "Not with ears, with her hands, with her breath, with her whole damn soul." The crowd stilled. "I have lived 38 years, he continued, voice low but unshaking, "and I can count on one hand the number of people who truly heard me, not just my words, but my silences, my regrets, my grief. And she did it without saying a single thing." He turned slightly, his eyes sweeping over them. "You want to run someone off for being different, for seeing the world you're too afraid to face. Fine, but you'll have to go through me." Patterson opened his mouth, then closed it. No one moved. Then slowly the crowd dispersed, torches unused, boots heavy. That night the ranch was silent except for the wind. Inside, Grace placed a pot of warm cider by the fire, then moved beside Samuel at the table. She did not sign, did not write, did not even look at him. But after a moment she reached out, rested her fingers on his hand. It was not thanks. It was recognition. He turned his palm upward, curled his fingers gently around hers, and together, in the stillness, they listened to the crackle of the wood, the hush of the night, and the bond growing between 2 souls that never needed words to speak. The first snowfall of December came quiet and slow, like someone laying down a blanket over all that had burned or broken. Grace stood by the window of the log kitchen, her fingers threading a needle through scraps of old fabric. Leather patches, wool cuffs, the lining from an old coat Samuel no longer wore. She was making a winter coat, not for herself, but for him. She did not need to hear the wind to know the cold was coming. Samuel watched her from the barn door. She moved with purpose, every motion deliberate. She had no words, but in the weeks since the townspeople had turned away and he had chosen to keep her there, his world had found rhythm again. She brewed coffee every morning before the sky turned grey. She lined the chicken coop with pine needles. She brushed the horses in slow circles and trained the yearlings using gestures no cowboy had ever thought to try. He had never seen animals respond that way to someone. She would stand still just long enough for a skittish foal to inch closer. Then she'd raise a single hand, slow and open, and wait. And somehow, always, they listened. The silence around the ranch no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like listening. One late afternoon, Samuel rode out toward the ridge, checking the fences before the storm they both knew was coming. The light had just begun to dim when his horse startled, a loose rock maybe, or a scent on the wind, and reared. He was thrown hard, landing shoulder first on frozen earth. The breath rushed from his chest. For a moment he could not feel anything but the throbbing pulse of pain where his arms struck a jutting root. He staggered to his feet, bleeding from the elbow. The sky was deepening fast. He wrapped a cloth around the wound and tried to walk, but each step sent sharp pain through his ribs. When he stumbled into the yard, the last light had faded. Grace burst from the cabin before he could knock. She had felt it, or perhaps she had just known, one of those strange, uncanny instincts of hers that no one could explain. She helped him inside, sat him down by the hearth, and peeled the cloth from his wound with gentle fingers. Her brow furrowed as she worked. She brought water, cleaned the gash, and pressed a poultice of yarrow and pine sap against it. He watched her. "You always know," he whispered. She met his eyes. Then, without warning, she lifted his hand to her face and pressed her lips, soft, warm, against the edge of the wound. Samuel stilled. The fire crackled and the room seemed to hold its breath. Grace did not speak, did not smile, but something passed between them like a door opening in the quiet. Later, as the storm rolled in and snow dusted the window panes, Samuel sat across from her at the table. He had taken a piece of paper from his desk drawer and written slowly, carefully, each letter shaped with meaning that could not be spoken aloud. He turned it to face her. "I want to hear your heart, if you'll let me listen with mine." She looked at the words for a long time, then her fingers reached out and touched them, one by one, as if to feel the truth inside the ink. When she finally raised her eyes, they were wet, but not from sorrow. She reached across the table and touched his chest, just once, just enough. And then, for the first time since she had entered his life, she smiled. Not a polite smile, not one of fear or thanks, but a smile like sunrise, like something breaking free after being held in too long. Outside, the wind howled, but inside that cabin a silence deeper than words had found its voice. And it was warm, and it was real. The days softened. Winter still gripped the mesas, but between storms, life returned slowly. So did something else, something quiet and steady between Samuel and Grace. She taught him simple sign language: water, fire, thank you. Her fingers moved like branches in the wind, and though he fumbled, she never laughed, only touched his hands, guiding them until he got it right. He taught her to ride. She had never sat a saddle before. The first time she clung to the horn, knuckles white, but he walked beside her, speaking low, though she could not hear. She moved with the horse anyway, sensing its rhythm through her bones. They built a small room off the cabin, part shelter, part refuge. There they shared meals and silence by the fire. They did not need words. Their glances said more than language could. He noticed things. She smiled when birds gathered at dusk. She flinched at sudden pops in the fire. She always knew a storm before it came. One night he spelled a sentence in shaky signs: "You make this place whole." She stared, then touched her fingers to his lips. Not a kiss, just a thank you, a way of saying, "I hear you too." Then came the storm that would change everything. Samuel had fallen asleep by the fire after repairing fences all day. The sky had been calm, no warning. The oil lamp flickered low. He woke to her hand on his shoulder. Grace pulled his coat and pointed toward the barn. Outside, the wind had shifted. Clouds raced past the moon. The air felt wrong, electric. In the barn, the horses thrashed. Grace moved through them like wind, touching each flank, calm and certain. A loud crack overhead. Samuel looked up. A beam split. "We need to move them," he shouted, but she was already leading the mare out, signing fast. "Roof falling now." Together they moved the horses to the shelter near the house. Rain hit the roof like fists just as the last animal cleared the door. The north beam gave way. The roof crashed where they had just stood. Samuel turned. Grace stood watching the barn collapse, hair soaked, chest rising. He looked at her, truly looked. She was still grounded, part of the wind and rain, not separate from it. "How did you know?" he asked. She touched her chest, then pointed to the sky. He understood. She felt it. Later in the cabin, he handed her a blanket and sat beside her. He took her hand and spelled, "You belong to this land." She smiled, then placed his hand on her chest, over her heart. And for the first time, he felt her rhythm, quiet, steady. She did not hear like others. She heard deeper, and Samuel, in that moment, knew he had finally been heard too. The wind that once carried whispers now brought footsteps, hesitant then trusting. Something had shifted in the town beyond Samuel's fences. Not loudly, not suddenly, but in silence, as most real change begins. The first was Tom Jenkins, a ranch hand with a torn shoulder. The doctor was back east, and no one else knew how to wrap a wound right. He arrived one grey morning, reins in one hand, the other arm limp. Samuel spotted him from the porch. "What do you want, Tom?" Tom nodded past him to where Grace was kneeling by the herb patch. "Heard she fixes things." Quietly. Samuel gave a slow nod. "She does." Grace came without a word. She examined the arm, her hands steady, her brow creased in thought. She moved as if listening, not to words, but to something deeper. When she pressed the right spot, Tom winced, then sighed with relief. 2 days later, a widow came. She hadn't slept in weeks, her hands shaking constantly. Grace sat with her at dusk, hands gently resting on her shoulders, until the trembling stopped. The next morning, the woman returned with a pie and a hand-knitted scarf. "For the girl," she said, "the one who hears more than we do." That winter passed with fewer raised voices, fewer names spat in fear. Samuel and Grace lived as before, quietly. But now passing townspeople tipped their hats. Some left preserves by the gate. Each morning Grace wrote on the chalkboard beside the kitchen, "Today will be good. I can feel it." Sometimes she was wrong, but most days she was right. And slowly, people believed it. Then came the Sunday that changed everything. The frost had just lifted when the church bell rang, and before its echo faded, panic spread. A 7-year-old boy had vanished from his family during morning chores. One boot was found near the tree line, nothing more. Men shouted, mothers cried, dogs barked. When Samuel and Grace heard, he reached for his coat. Grace was already beside him, placed a hand on his arm, then knelt. She pressed her hands to the earth, palms, wrists, her whole forearm. Then she crawled forward, pausing, tracing subtle marks, a shifted pebble, a broken twig. She stood and walked. She did not look back, but they followed, Samuel, then Tom, then others, through thickets, up ridges, down dry creek beds, until, in a cedar grove clearing, they saw him. The boy, curled beneath a fallen tree, his ankles swollen, his face streaked with dirt and tears. Grace ran. She knelt, checked his leg, brushed hair from his eyes. Then she looked up at Samuel, not proud, not triumphant, just relieved. When the boy was safe and the story retold, no one called her strange. They called her what she truly was, the girl who hears with her heart. The wind moved slow that evening, brushing gently over the tall grass, like it remembered every name that had ever been whispered on that land. Years passed. The ranch still stood, weathered, wiser, wrapped in the steady rhythm of a life not hurried. Samuel walked a little slower now, and silver threads appeared in Grace's long hair, but neither of them kept track of years and numbers. They counted time in seasons, in moments held quietly between two hands. In the soundless way a heart says, "I'm still here." The children came most mornings, from the town, from the edge of the hills, from places where words were often thrown too fast or forgotten too easily. Here they found something different. They learned to listen, not with ears, but with their whole being. They sat with Grace in the garden as she taught them how to know the difference between fear and shyness in the twitch of a rabbit's nose. They stood beside her in the stable and watched her place a single hand on a horse's flank, calming it with nothing but her breath. She did not teach with rules. She taught with silence, and with the rare, precious way she smiled when they understood something without having to say it out loud. Samuel built a wooden bench beneath the cottonwood tree behind the house. That's where they sat most evenings, he and Grace, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun settle into the mesas. On those evenings, neither spoke much. They didn't have to. He would pour 2 mugs of coffee, still warm from the pot, and she would take his hand, thumb tracing a slow rhythm across the back of it. Sometimes he would bring out an old harmonica and play a tune with no name, and she would close her eyes and sway as if she could feel the song ripple through the dusk. Then one evening, as shadows stretched across the wheat field and a hush fell over the trees, Grace turned to him. She had learned a little speech over the years, not much, just enough to read lips and shape a few careful words. Most days she still preferred her hands, but this time she spoke with her voice, a voice not used to being heard, soft as a leaf falling in snow. "I do not need sound," she whispered. "Only you." Samuel blinked. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he nodded gently, his throat tightening as he answered, "I hear you, always have." They stayed like that until the last light faded from the sky. The next morning, a new group of children arrived. Grace wrote a sentence in chalk across the wooden slate nailed beside the front door. She did it every morning, like a ritual. Today it read, "The day will be kind. I feel it." No one asked how she knew. They just believed her. And when the old folks in town talked about the girl who once could not speak or hear, they did not whisper the word witch anymore. They called her the one who listens with her heart. But some still shook their heads in doubt, but most just smiled or nodded or came by with a pie and stayed long enough to leave with something gentler in their chest. That winter, a boy got lost during a blizzard. Grace knelt in the snow outside the barn, pressed her palms to the ground, and tilted her face to the wind. Then she stood, pointed west. Samuel followed her for 3 miles through a grove of pine until they found the boy curled beneath a fallen log, alive, frightened, but safe. They never questioned her again after that. The final scene of the year found Samuel and Grace walking together through the pasture. The sky was wide, brushed with amber and violet. Their steps were slow, steady. A mare and her foal grazed nearby. The world was quiet, but never empty. They stopped at the top of the hill. Grace turned to him and for the first time laughed. Not a loud sound, but a ripple of air that shook her shoulders and lit her face like dawn. Samuel smiled and kissed her temple. No one told their story. It didn't need to be told, because it was still happening. And sometimes the truest love is not the one shouted from rooftops, but the kind that walks beside you in silence every day and never asks to be anything more than real. If your heart has ever paused for a gaze that understood without words, if you believe that love does not need a voice to be heard, only a soul brave enough to feel, then the story of Samuel and Grace was meant for you. Out on the quiet plains of the American West, where wind and silence speak in the same tongue, a lonely rancher and a girl the world called deaf discovered a language deeper than sound, a language of hands, of glances, of hearts that knew how to listen. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If stories of love that endure through prejudice, pain, and unspoken grace speak to you, know that there are always more to discover. Love is not just told, it's remembered, it's reclaimed, and it echoes long after the last word fades. Until we meet again in the next story, may your quiet moments be full, and may someone always hear the heart you carry. Years later, when Grace's hair had turned completely silver and Samuel walked with a carved oak cane he'd made himself, they still sat every afternoon beneath the cottonwood. The children who had learned from her now brought their own little ones, a new generation growing up knowing there was a language beyond words. One of those children, a boy no more than 5, came running one autumn afternoon, eyes bright with excitement. He had found an injured bird near the creek, a mockingbird with a broken wing. Grace rose slowly, her movements more careful now, but her eyes still clear and attentive. She knelt beside the boy, watched the bird for a long moment, then cupped her hands gently. The mockingbird, which had struggled in fear when others approached, went still under her touch. With precise movements that spoke of decades of silent healing, she splinted the delicate wing with threads from her own clothing. "Miss Grace," the boy asked softly, "how do you always know what they need?" Grace smiled, that same smile that had lit Samuel's heart so many years before. She placed her hand over the boy's small chest, right where his heart beat fast with curiosity, then pointed to her own eyes, her ears, her hands. She didn't need words to explain. He understood. That night, as the mockingbird rested in a small cage Samuel had built, he and Grace sat in contemplative silence. The full moon poured silver light over the fields, and in the night air they could hear the distant song of a meadowlark. "We built something beautiful here," Samuel murmured, his voice rough with time, but still full of tenderness. Grace took his hand, intertwined her fingers with his, and for the first time in years spoke with her soft voice. "We didn't build. We just listened to what was already here." And so, beneath the infinite stars of the Oklahoma sky, two souls who found each other in silence continued to teach the world that true love doesn't make noise. It just exists, steady and constant as the wind that had always blown across the prairie, carrying stories of hearts that knew how to hear each other through time.